Welcome to the EchoJunction podcast.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining me for episode number 109 of the EchoJunction podcast. We're talking social and digital. My name is Adam Fraser, I'm the founder of EchoJunction, and if you're interested in the strategic landscape of social media, digital marketing and marketing technology, this is very much the podcast for you. Have an amazing guest to bring you today. It's Mr. Mark Ritson. Mark is Adjunct Professor at the Melbourne Business School. He teaches marketing to MBA students, 20-plus career in both marketing academia, but also very much working at the coalface with major brands. So Mark is quite a character on the Australian scene. Some of you may be surprised I'd ask Mark to join this podcast, given my focus on social media technology, but the podcast is all about bringing a breadth of views and balanced perspectives, and I love debating with anyone and everyone this whole landscape. So Mark, always interesting, always insightful, despite the controversy, always backed by facts and figures, as I guess you'd expect from someone with an academic background. So hope you enjoy the chat with Mark. He kept me on my toes, that is for sure. Enjoy this conversation, and I will check in with you at the end. I'm delighted to welcome Mark Ritson to the EchoJunction podcast. Mark is Adjunct Professor of Marketing at Melbourne Business School. Mark, very big welcome to the podcast.
Hey Adam, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Very excited to have you on the podcast. Looking forward to exploring various marketing and digital topics. So let's get straight into it, Mark. We have a pretty healthy global audience. I'm sure everyone in Australia will know all about you, but for the global listeners and anyone that doesn't know your backstory, maybe just give us a quick summary of your career to date.
Yeah, so I'm a marketing professor of about sort of 20 odd years now. I started my career really in America after my PhD in the States, and then I moved to London Business School for many years, and then more recently I've been down in Australia at Melbourne Business School for well over a decade now. And I like some business school professors, not all, I practice a lot. So although I'm still teaching MBA students, I probably do at least 4 or 5 days of actual consulting work for every day I teach. So I'm relatively practical, and my main focus is in brand management.
Great stuff. Look, I've seen a lot of your content, Mark, a lot of your keynotes, regularly read your pieces in Marketing Week and The Australian, and I think, look, let's dive in. It's rare for me to have, in fact, 100-plus episodes. You are the first professor I've had on the podcast, so tempted as I am to dive into the things the audience really want to, what does Mark think about Snapchat? What does Mark think about social media? I do want to start at the more theoretical level, and I've seen you talk a lot, Mark, about this difference between strategy and tactics, and marketers unfortunately seem to dive straight into sort of execution and tactical thinking. So I guess set the framework for us, Mark. What does a strategic planning, what does a marketing strategy process look like today?
Well, I mean, how it actually looks versus how it should look is an interesting mismatch, but let's talk about how it should look. So there are really 3 phases in good brand or marketing planning. The first is a diagnosis phase using data. The second is the strategic phase where we work out where we're going to play. And then the third is the tactical phase where obviously we incorporate the various actions that will deliver the strategy. And if we zoom into that strategic phase, really it boils down to answering 3 questions very clearly. The first one is, where do we want to play, i.e. which segments are we targeting, and equally importantly, which ones we're not going after. What do we want to stand for? And again, this can be based on a position, proposition, brand essence. It doesn't really matter, but what do we want to actually communicate to our target on who we are? And then finally, the bit that's often missed, which is, what are the objectives we might have for that target market? So what are we trying to do? Obviously, we want to generate sales and profit and so forth. But to do that, there are different levers that we can pull that range all the way from awareness all the way through to loyalty and repeat purchase. So what are we trying to actually achieve? And they're the 3 core strategy questions. And so marketing strategy at its fundamental basis is coming up with the answers to those questions.
Okay, and look, we'll talk a bit more about why marketers seem to sort of have absolved themselves of some elements of that strategic planning process and jumping straight to execution. But let's talk even about in terms of execution framework, Mark. I'm getting into a dangerous zone. You're a professor, but looking into the history of marketing, if I'm right, that the 4Ps, that is a widely known sort of framework for developing a marketing execution plan. This was sort of post-war thinking in late 50s, early 60s. So 50 plus years old now. I still quite like it in terms of the questions it makes you ask. But what's your views of the 4Ps of a framework for building a marketing plan?
Yeah, it's always been oversimplistic. I mean, even when it was first created, I don't think it covered everything, and it tends to, infer there are 4 very simple decisions when really there are many hundred. But yeah, I think the 4Ps, you can use it, and I certainly think it still has some merit. More generally speaking, it's a nice reminder of the more general and much broader set of challenges that we have when it comes to tactics. There are 4 main areas, but these days you have consumer experience. These days communication is broken up into many different streams. Pricing has the challenge of price setting, and then price maintenance, and so on and so on. So I think, it's not a bad framework. I don't think it's outdated. I don't think it's ever really been, detailed enough to be fit for purpose. But it's a good challenge, a good initial challenge.
Sure. Look, it did get me thinking, Mark, in preparing for this podcast chat and taking a more holistic strategic planning sort of view of the marketing sector. I mean, look, as a case study of one, I'm relatively new to this space. So call it 3 years. I've really been embracing marketing technology, social media marketing more broadly. And if I sort of look back on the countless podcasts, blogs, white papers, conference presentations I've seen, and it's a lot, it's almost exclusively focused, in fact, on one of the Ps, let alone the strategy. It's almost like 3 of the 4 Ps have been lost. And we talk pretty much endlessly about the promotion or, advertising and spin-offs thereof, within that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good observation. I mean, I think we've seen 2 things happening over the last particularly 10 years. A lot of people coming into the industry without any training of any kind. And as a result, they take their consumer experiences, where marketing is obviously just the communications part, and assume that that's what marketing fundamentally is. And at the same time, the organizations, in many cases, have taken more and more of the strategic and tactical work away from marketers because they don't think they're capable, leaving them just with comms. Product is for someone else now. Pricing can't be left to the marketers because they're not quantitative enough, and so on and so on. So I do think we are now in a place where, I had a great debate at the end of last year with Adam Fraser about, we debated with ADMA, the big sort of digital marketing group in Australia, whether social media was the main, I forget the actual title, is social media the future of marketing? And the point I made is, it's not even the future of communications, in my opinion, but even if it was, that would still only make it about 10% of the marketing challenge, because we've got all of the tactical stuff related to product development, related to channels of distribution and the strategy, and so on and so on. So, I really think that your observation is true, and that there is this almost total focus on communications at the expense of equally, if not more important, tactical questions, and then more broadly strategic questions that just don't happen anymore.
Yeah, look, Apple alert, Mark, I'm contractually obliged to talk about Apple, Red Bull or millennials in every third podcast, but it did get me thinking. People will talk about Apple and the product, the marketing is baked into the product. And again, this is a massive observation you're making, because if you just deliver, if the marketer has no say in, product, packaging, supply chain, distribution strategy, you're kind of in danger of the just put lipstick on this pig, because, great, I don't know if you get your great marketing and great creative with a crappy product, it's not really going to get you too far, is it?
No, and therein lies a major challenge for marketers, because we are increasingly, we've always been seen as the colouring in department, but increasingly it appears to be true. We are responsible for the most superficial elements, and that's it. Even consumer experience more and more seems to be being pulled away from the actual marketing department. So it's a tricky one, and again, it's a function of, if you look at the gurus and heroes of marketing, they're all working in an area of communications. Now, there's many different names for it now, from content marketing all the way across to digital media, to lead management. I mean, all these things sound like these are all very different, areas, but they're just subsets of communications, and by definition, they're in about a 10% area of the total marketing field.
Look, Mark, as you've said, even on this podcast, and I've read a lot of your work, you're sort of openly critical of marketers not doing the strategic planning piece. And it is a massive shift in the function and focus of marketers. But again, what's your view on org structures and the way enterprises are organised today more generally? I mean, just to throw out a few names, Chief Data Officer, Chief Customer Officer, Chief Content Officer, Chief Revenue Officer, the list goes on. All sort of chipping away at historic responsibilities that the marketer may have had. I mean, are marketers always to blame? Has this sort of been stolen from them? And in essence, they end up almost de facto chief advertising officers, even though they're called chief marketing officers.
There's been a really tricky period, I think, where we've tried to put marketers into the boardroom, and unfortunately, where we've succeeded, the general response of the board has been, well, this man or woman isn't up to it. So I'm always skeptical of the desire to elevate chief marketing officers, because frankly I don't think, with a few notable exceptions, they are actually up to a board level position, and I think they get found out pretty quickly. So before we start creating chief marketing officers more frequently, we might want to pause and worry about the quality of the people in those positions.
Look, Mark, last question kind of on this sort of high-level strategic area, or the responsibility of the marketer. A big topic on this podcast is sort of, you've talked about customer experience, but just hardcore customer service, customer support, whether that's on social or phone centres or email, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I mean, just historically, is that kind of a new phenomenon? Is that the opposite effect, where that's a responsibility that marketers maybe in the past haven't had, but now that's coming into the area?
Yeah, I get mixed reports on consumer experience. I think it's always been there initially as a sort of subset of communications. It went almost in the old world. It was all about events and product experience and service. We're all in there somewhere. We've sort of pulled it out now as a separate area, which I do think makes an awful lot of sense. And I'm a big fan of Touchpoints and creating a Touchpoint model for a lot of brands, not just service brands. But yeah, again, what's happened is that the whole consumer experience movement has become codified and institutionalized, and gradually has separated itself away from marketing, to the point now where you'll find a lot of CX people are sort of, we're a little bit sniffy about being identified as marketers and see themselves as something else. So yeah, I do think it's an important aspect, and again, I do think it's something that in many cases marketers are, with their inherent focus on communication rather than on maybe what the experience is, are starting to lose out.
And again, back to Apple and a number of other leading brands, do you obviously creative and outbound and those things still matter, but are you on board with the kind of theory that's often spouted that, customer experience, every touch point with the brand is becoming an increasingly important sort of contributor to that brand experience, I suppose?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the work I've done over the years with Touchpoints is really twofold. One is just generically fixing problems. So, the irony of Touchpoints is that most companies don't know what the big Touchpoints are because they don't see it through the customer's eyes. And I've seen that firsthand over and over again. So identifying the key Touchpoints and making them less unpleasant. Some Touchpoints are always going to be painful. You're paying a bill. It's not going to be a joyous experience, but you can make it less painful. And then the second part of the journey to your question is then finding as many of these touch points as possible where we can imbue the brand positioning into the experience, because advertising on its own is a very limited touch point. So how else can we get that positioning into the different places where the consumer experiences the brand? And I think that's the nut of the challenge when it comes to these customer journeys.
I mean, back to Apple, there's many reasons and clearly many people around the world, we're talking about the world's most valuable brand, I'm pretty sure. But, the Genius Bar, that's a pretty mundane, boring business process aspect of how they run their business. But to me, it's a massive factor in why I don't even think before I upgrade, to the iPhone 7, because in the times when I have had problems, they're conveniently located, investing in real estate, and frankly, you can talk to a human being who solves your problem, and I think that's a big part of the story.
Yeah, no, I think that Apple's simplicity has enabled them to I think do things that everyone else in that tech space has missed, which is just look for the simplest, fastest route to solving a consumer's problem. And I think of all the genes in the Apple DNA, the one that says, look, simple is better, has probably served them extraordinarily well in that case, because that is usually the answer. The customer is not that complex a beast. It's the systems that companies create around them that is problematic. And yeah, I think you're right. The Genius Bar is a perfect example of what most brands still fail to achieve. I mean, the famous trawl through a company's website to try and find the phone number to speak to someone is a perfect example of how these companies are missing the point.
Look, Mark, let's shift gears a little bit for the second half of the interview and talk about, I suppose, social media and the digital landscape more broadly. I know it's it's an area you've got some strong views on. So I suppose if I can ease you in, I mean, social media, I think, undisputably has had a big impact on society more broadly. If you think of 25% of the world now on Facebook, 700 million on Instagram, billion plus on various messenger platforms, etc., etc. But I think your view is it's had a disproportionate view on the marketing world. What's your view on social more broadly, and what role should it play in the marketer's thinking?
Oh, look, I think it's by and large been a complete failure, and so I'm going to be very careful in how I say this to not give the wrong impression, which I often do. Clearly, that social media has revolutionized the world of peer-to-peer communication. I mean, the very term social media tells you what it does best, right? It's person-to-person communication. Where I think we are now fully and utterly convinced, whether we care to admit it or not, is that brands entering that space through conversations, dialogue, organic interactions was never going to work. And I think that's been borne out. I mean, if it ever could have worked in theory, then what Mark Zuckerberg et al. Have done with eradicating organic connections has certainly made it doubly true. And what's interesting, I was looking at BBDO in the US were voted Digital Agency of the Year in December by one of the big, I think it was Media Post. And the reason they gave the award to them is they said, look, basically BBDO have worked out that social media as an organic tool for brands talking to consumers is dead. But they've managed to migrate to a digital media approach. And I think it's very interesting because it confirms that social media as a vehicle for communicating with consumers was always pants. Second, it worries the hell out of me because the whole world seemed to basically lose their shit about it. And yet, it's turned out to be totally pointless. Third, no one has actually said that out loud and said, well, all that 5-year period where we all went mental and Mark Zuckerberg said there'd be a new model of advertising where we talk to consumers and collaborate with them and we're all in this happy, beautiful, friendly world together. That's all pants, but it's over now. No one's done that. And I think that is a scary proposition, right? It certainly does lead us to a model which we now, I think, increasingly just refer to as being digital or digital media, which works much more effectively. But it works much more effectively because it's just advertising again, albeit in new media forms. But my point in all of that is we've all lived through that. We were all there in 2008, 2009 when everyone went mental about having relationships with customers and talking to them. And I was shouted down at conference and speech after speech that I was completely lunatic because I was saying it was nonsense, right? And yet it turns out I'm right, or I was right at the time, and we've moved on. But no one mentioned it, almost as if we're a little bit embarrassed about what we did. And that worries me because it means we haven't learned. And I'm not saying programmatic is a lot of rubbish. Well, I will later if you want me to. But what I'm saying is that the perception and the ability of most marketers to fall for anything new and shiny and this mass delusion, the best evidence would be social media. And all those social agencies, I don't know where they've gone to now. They've become digital agencies. But we all fell for it. Pepsi fell for it. Ford fell for it. Everybody fell for it. And yet we've moved on without recognizing that we had to move on.
Look, Mark, agree with a lot of what you just said. I do want to unpack and probe a couple of things. I think, do I want a relationship with Colgate or my toilet paper brand or, various other household mundane products? Absolutely not. Do I want them joining the conversation? I'm doing the air quotes about the Oscars or Miley Cyrus or the name of the royal baby, as Nissan and Pizza Express did. No, complete nonsense. And I think the Oreo tweet created a lot of wasted time on joining conversations which I guess they weren't invited to. Where I do think it's got a place, I suppose, is twofold, and I'm keen to get your thoughts. Is one, back to our earlier chat about marketing theory. I know you talk about market orientation and listening and understanding your customer. So I think social listening can be a very valuable use of social. And then just straight customer service. If it's convenient for me to reach out to you on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram while I'm standing in the line at the supermarket or I'm on a train, I think that's something where brands can add value to the overall customer experience. So I guess, what are your thoughts on social listening and social response?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, social listening, I think it's a great little qualitative tool. Can't be quantitative because the market will never be representative. So you can never count the numbers. And again, the people that have some formal marketing training would work that out. But with alas, again, the professionals out there that use social as a quantitative tool, it has enormous problems there. But yeah, it's a nice little qualitative tool. So is a focus group. So is telephone interviewing. So it certainly it offers I think a legitimate qualitative insight that's often more convenient. And then in terms of service, it again doesn't do any harm. It's just phenomenally unproductive to use social media as a source of handling customer complaints. You'd be better off having a helpline and having people talk to humans straight away. Not that it doesn't work. It's just a strange tool it's like using a screwdriver to wedge a door open. You can do it, but it's by all means not the best tool to use. So I think that there is some functionality of it left, sort of, but it was sold to us literally by Zuckerberg, as the future of advertising has changed after 100 years, and it didn't. We just got a new model of intrusive mass advertising, albeit with better metrics. You know what I mean? It's a stunning moment that no one talks about it. You know what I mean? Blows me away.
Look, Mark, you talked about focus on shiny new toys. I'm interested just to probe your thinking about that. I actually just earlier today I recorded another. I presume you're familiar with that infographic, the landscape with the thousands of logos showing the marketing technology landscape. Yeah, I know. So I had Scott Brinker on, who's chiefmartech.com, great domain. And, I had him 2 years ago, there were 2,000 tools. Then last year, there were 3,500 tools. I don't know if you've seen a couple of weeks ago, or last week, in fact, he's released the new one. I think it's 4,800 providers with 5,300 offerings, ranging from your Salesforce and your Adobes and your Marketos and your big enterprise platforms through to your niche providers. So I suppose that's one example. On the other, as we know, Meerkat comes out and Periscope comes out and Snapchat comes out, and we're just desperate to jump on the latest, greatest thing rather than focusing on those sort of boring basics that I talked about earlier, just making the customer's life easier. So what's driving that about the marketing space? What do you think?
Well, there's low barriers to entry at the moment, and there is still that startup culture, and it's a new Wild West, and that's attractive. I would point out, though, if you look at the M&A activity and the funding, it's disappearing off the chart. So what is about to happen is a gigantic bloodbath, and that chart will probably never be populated as much again. And what you're going to see is very quickly now all of that will disappear. Not disappear, but it will start to be strangled by the digital duopoly. So I think it's pretty well known now that since about Q3 last year, every incremental increase in digital media has gone to Google, Alphabet, and Facebook. And so essentially those millions of companies are all standing still as in total revenue, but as more and more are produced, they're eating each other alive. And we're going to reach a point soon, of course, where Google and Facebook's revenue acquisition will actually surpass the growth in the market, and then that feeding frenzy will increase even more. So we're at the end of a phase that will rapidly emerge as the two big gorillas clean up, basically.
So a phase of consolidation coming, or people just, capitalism cleaning out those that can't survive.
Well, capitalism cleaning out everyone except those two. I mean, that's what a duopoly is. Those guys, I mean, Amazon to the left-hand side is an interesting play, but none of those intermediaries in the middle are going to survive, clearly. I mean, these two companies, we don't use the duopoly word lightly. It's, right now in the developed world, we have about 50% of media being spent digitally, and about 50% of that 50% is spent between those two. And the point is, it's growing. So what we do about that, I have no idea. It's a bit late, really, to do anything. But we are now in a place of extraordinary pain, which, again, because everyone's obsessed with the pinball machines, no one's spotted it. But it's an incredibly dangerous time ahead. And it's not to say anyone at Facebook or Google is evil or anything else. They're delightful people. But they have too much market power in an area where market power goes a very long way. And so, the travails at various smaller players, starting with Snapchat, will become increasingly pronounced as time goes on.
Yeah. So as, Mark, we're recording this sort of mid-May 2017. We're sort of fresh off some challenges Google and YouTube have faced. And this sort of brings up the programmatic issue that you mentioned earlier. So obviously brands' paid promotions appearing alongside highly objectionable content. And suddenly people being very aware of brand risk. Look, I agree about the absolute power of the duopoly that's emerged, but is that a little crack in the facade appearing there? The fact that Google, the smartest guys in the room, their AI is still not quite ready for prime time. The fact that they're allowing leading brands to be matched against this, objectionable content.
Yeah, I think the argument's good. I think it certainly proves that the AI and programmatic in general is not what we've been sold. I think that's a fair point. But I don't see that money going away from Google in any kind of enduring fashion, right? It'll just gradually dribble back. So if it was a true crack in the duopolistic control, then money would flow away and to other vendors and so on. But that's not going to happen. I think that they'll tighten the leash a little bit, and businesses probably now, and if not now, very soon, return to usual. I don't think you've got any chance, because the leading marketers and the non-leading marketers don't really care whether it works or not. They are driven by the need to invest in this thing. I mean, the latest stuff from the World Federation of Advertisers, they talk to the top 50 CMOs in the world, and we're talking, I think, $70 or $80 billion of advertising a year in spend. And the majority of them agreed that, brands are over-investing in digital, and the majority agreed that the measurement wasn't good enough. But when they asked them if they're going to spend more on digital media next year, I think nearly 3/4 said yes. So there's no real, there's no way around it. Brands are going to want to spend more on digital every year, and more of that will go to Google and Facebook. And I don't see any way, with the exception of the little Amazon play, that isn't going to be the case.
I mean, I suppose ultimately, unless people are making entirely irrational decisions, the performance has to come through. So you've got, and I know you wrote about this, Adidas sort of announcing they were going to go, 100% digital? But ultimately, if we stop selling stuff, which we may have lost sight, that's why we're here, would that trigger a rethink?
Yeah, but you've got your age-old problem with spending on investment in communications doesn't correlate directly with sales at any point, right? There's lead and lag effects and other factors to play. I mean, programmatic, there are many case studies where, there's a great case study from one of the large investment banks in America where they basically pulled out of about 98% of the programmatic advertising sites they were going to and saw no noticeable impact in lead generation. So, look, the simple fact is if people knew what they were doing, I mean, they wouldn't be doing that. I mean, programmatic's cut is currently around, it depends who you look at, right? But it's probably about 70%. So your working capital is only 30 cents in the dollar in programmatic. So if you knew what you were doing, that clearly would stop you doing that, right? So it's the main story of marketing at the moment in the world of digital is clients that literally have no idea what's going on. No idea at all. So, I mean, you saw that with Mark Pritchard's talk in January. He admitted, look, he caught his agency with a value bank and doing circa missions, and he confronted them, and they said, oh, no, we've got a contract from you that says we can do that. And he went, oh, I didn't realise. And that's P&G, and he very honestly admitted to it. So if P&G don't know what's going on, then nobody does, in my opinion. So I think that's why you're seeing Accenture and the like all now looking at marketing and media in more detail. It's because there's tremendously large amounts of money being spent in very suboptimal ways, and that means there's an opportunity to restructure.
Yeah. Look, Mark, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you've got a tight timetable today, so just one final question. It's a big one, so it's probably unfair to squeeze it in at the end, but you talked about Facebook and Google and the sort of digital duopoly. I know you write a lot about TV and, you know, the deft headlines about TV is dead and so forth, but clearly there's a big pie of media spend still in TV. I know sort of Facebook, you know, they're very focused on live video, and now I'm seeing, you know, can I call it TV-like content? That's a whole podcast to itself about what is TV today, but you see Facebook and or Google starting to have a real crack at that space.
Oh yeah, I think it's the greatest game of bait and switch in marketing. So if you look, let's just look at Facebook. So what Zuckerberg did, and I don't know if he did this on purpose, but he announced the end of advertising, organic, dialogue with consumers using Facebook in 2007. Didn't work, and then partly didn't work because he stopped those organic interactions and forced brands to pay. And so that was a very good bait and switch. You sell someone on a new model, and then once you've got them in, you start to monetize the thing. And I think what you're seeing now is the second great bait and switch, which is TV is dead, TV's over, TV's finished, until Google and Facebook start buying and creating TV channels, and suddenly, oh, you know what, there's a lot of life in it now. And that's exactly what they're going to do for a couple of reasons. What no one's thinking about yet, because it's still all in early stages, is TV has a couple of stunning advantages over digital in terms of content. And people, again, happily laugh at my simplistic notions. First of all, it's got a giant, big screen. And that means it's a social screen, rather than these little screens that we carry around in our pockets for ourselves. So the minute anything becomes social, we're going to want to see it on TV. Second, content is a real problem for these companies, and TV has natural core competence in content. And third, and perhaps most importantly, we get consumers when they're passive. The big problem with digital advertising is, we have trained our consumers to use their fingers to move and navigate and switch and flick and turn. So the idea of them watching a static 15-second film is impossible. Whereas with the TV, we get them when they're tired and they're sitting down and they're exhausted. So I think that's the big advantage.
There we go, ladies and gents, Mr. Mark Ritson. I am not typically rude to my guests, as long-term listeners of the podcast will know. We had a few technology challenges at the end, so hence the reason for the sort of hard cut-off at the end of the podcast, and unfortunately no time for the quick fire round as a result. But look, great to have Mark on. He's got an incredibly busy timetable. Appreciate him squeezing me in. And yeah, always interesting to hear his views. So I hope you got a lot of value out of the podcast. I know I certainly did. Episode number 109 coming to a close. Ladies and gents, thank you so much for your ongoing support of this podcast. Please head over to echojunction.com.au if you want to stay up to date with what is happening in the world of EchoJunction. Many thanks for being with me, and I look forward to seeing you on a future podcast episode.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe on iTunes, where you can also leave a review. Be social, and we'll see you again next week.